Well, I grew up in Bow, and I went to Bow School, so for grades 1 through 8, I went to school with the same 30 kids.
Same 30 kids,
Yeah.
grades 1 through 8.
Yeah.
And what did that teach you?
It actually taught me that, first of all, the small classes were a really big help. We got lots of attention. There was a lot of interaction, a lot of ability to participate.
Okay.
And that's the model I've gone by my whole life. I've been in education my whole life. So.
Okay. Yeah.
I had the opposite in a way. I grew up in Manchester, so I had a much bigger school, and every year it was fresh faces, new people, large class sizes. So for me, it was I kind of learned how to interact and how to deal with a whole bunch of diversity and different kinds of backgrounds, as well as in education, how to be accountable for myself rather than expecting someone to be strict with backgrounds.
Okay. One more or two?
I could share. Mine was very unique. So, growing up, I think I had a very good education in New Jersey, northern New Jersey. Then when I was 13, we moved to Savannah, Georgia. The year was 1969.
Okay.
So they had some schools that were integrated.
Okay.
We thought that I would go and walk to the local high school. That didn't happen. So I attended what had been an all-black high school before.
Okay.
This white face came into that.
That's no fun.
So that was a whole different experience in education that didn't always come from the books.
And what did you think you learned from that?
How to listen and understand people. And, well, a big lesson was bigotry goes both ways for different reasons. And money has a lot to do with education and sports and things like that. So that was probably a defining moment. And then I went to a small college up in Maine after that. But
Well, thank you. Keep that in mind as we go back, because we're going to circle back to that at the very end when we talk about SB 193. But when we look at developing a civil society, and I just wrote like a 16-page paper on how we teach civics at Bow. A local citizen asked me to produce that so he could make sure we're producing good civic people. I've liked this quote for a long time. A child who can read but chooses not to is not much better off than a child who is unable to read. And we focus so much on the skills and so forth, but if we don't inculcate in children a love of reading and a love of books, they're not going to read. And so teaching wasn't good. So let's move that over to citizenship. If you produce people who are unwilling to participate in civic life, they're unwilling to come out to meetings, they're unwilling to run for offices, they're unwilling to go out and participate in that rich civic life, they're not much better than people that are unaware that that life exists. So one of our goals in schools, we don't have to teach the students about civics and about democracy, but we have to have a structure of school that is such a way that they're going to want to grow up and be part of the democratic process. So if we look at the history of schooling, in the history of education, there's been two kind of major goals we're looking for. One is to provide workers for the economy, and in the present parlance, we call that college and career ready. We want people ready to go to college, we want people ready to step into careers, and this is all those reports you hear that, we're not turning out people who are ready for the American workforce, other nations are beating us in all these sort of ways, and we just need to produce a worker who is ready to step into the economy. And of course, the other goal that's always been there is to educate citizens for responsible participation in the democracy. We need to build the future. We need to build the next generation. And there's a quote from Thomas Jefferson up there. And so what most of us remember, and it's the one that is called out most of the time when people think about school, because they have a picture of the school they grew up in, is what's called the factory model of education. And it was a very useful model for the time that it was developed for. There was a large immigrant population in America. They needed to be Americanized, and they needed to be trained to work in factories. So what sort of education did you have? You have education that was very hierarchical. You had education that was very controlled. You wanted to make sure that people were Americanized. So we had what's called holiday curriculum. I don't know, when you grew up, every holiday was a celebration. And we just learned about all the different holidays of the year. And it was all sorts of fun. Celebrated Christmas, celebrated Thanksgiving. I mean, go through the fall, right? You did Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and so forth. And they were teaching people to be Americanized. The create school design. A hallway down the middle, classrooms off the side. That's a very efficient and effective model. And hierarchical leadership. The teacher is in front, they're in charge, don't question that person. Sit down, shut up, listen, and we'll feed you. And very rigid grade and time schedules. You're in first grade, you don't mix with anyone else but first graders, you mix in second. A very efficient and effective system. And we look at that and we say, well, that's not a system that works for today. Well, no. It was developed at a specific time when America needed to do something, and they needed to train a large group of people to basically work in manufacturing jobs. And it worked fairly well at the time that it did. Well, the modern classroom is a little bit different. Because when we look forward, students are going to work in a global village. And that's a little bit of an oxymoron. They're going to work globally. They're going to interact with people all around the world and all around the globe. But they're going to do it in small, tight, woven groups of people. In fact, one gentleman was here. Who was here? You're talking about how you work. You live in Bow, but where do you work? Where is it?
That's Tom.
That was my husband. He had to go home and get something for me.
But he lives in Bow. He lives in Bow, but where does he work?
Yeah, he works at home. Actually, I work at home too, but my office is in New Mexico.
Yeah, and that is kind of the wave of the future. Where you live won't necessarily be where you work. You won't necessarily physically go to work. So it's technologically advanced. You have to collaborate across time and space. Not only across space, but also sometimes time. You may be working with someone who is 8 hours advanced or 8 hours behind you in the time zone. You need to learn to work in teams with people who are very different from you. You know, one of the things about the factory model is we kind of homogenize people. We put people all together. First graders were all together, and furthermore, we separated them to advanced, middle, and low. And so we kind of got all the people who are alike together because it's an efficient model to deliver education. That's not what we're looking at now. We're looking at diverse teams with all different ability levels being able to work together. And you know, one of the things that we really struggle that we have to teach children is they need to learn how to have civil discourse in a world that's increasingly polarized and insulated. Now, how do you get people to talk together and understand each other? It's going to be critical to work. When you were on the assembly line, you really didn't have to work with somebody. You had to just do your job and keep doing it and do it consistently and over. In the world of work tomorrow, it's going to be very different. You're going to have to work with different people who you may have a different language, a different culture, and you're going to have to work together in small teams to do projects and then disperse and reform. Anywhere, anytime, personalized. So we have a whole different model of schooling there. Public education, one of the things about public education, one of the questions we're going to ask later on at the end of the night is who owns the child? And public education wasn't always the norm. Public education came into being partly because, like some of the founders of democracy and Horace Mann said, we need an educated populace for democracy. But it also came into the equation when you had those large populations of immigrants coming in and said, we need to provide education for the masses. There are other models. You can go with private education, and you can have people, you know, is public education a right that really should be given to all people in your society? Or is it a private thing that really some people should be able to afford and some people shouldn't? When you look at the early founders of the United States, only rich white men were educated. That was it. And the goal of education was to rake the pearls from the muck. Let's separate those people who are going to lead from the common people. We'll educate those people who are going to lead, and let's not educate them. But when public education came about, there was a large battle over, okay, if the public is going to pay for a benefit like this, They must distribute it equally. And that's been really the role of the federal in government in looking at education. And it really comes up to separate is inherently unequal. And we can go back to race, gender, culture, creed, sexual orientation, disability. But it starts after, of course, the Civil War and Jim Crow laws and all those things, where you had separate schooling funded by taxpayer dollars. You said it over here. White kids in this school, black kids in this school, boys in this school, girls in this school, Christians over here, Jews over here. And the point that the feds always made is separate is inherently unequal. When Brown versus Board of Education came in 1954, the ACLU was looking for a case to bring in and do away with legal segregation. And what happened to those schools is they came, the ACLU talked to them, and they went to the school boards and said, we want to integrate the schools. And the school board said, wait, whoa, we can't integrate schools. Instead, we'll buy you the best black high school that money can buy. We'll buy you a black high school that looks better than any white high school can happen. And they said, no, we want integrated schools because separate is inherently unequal. You can talk about Brown versus Education 54, Title IX in 1972, similar sort of thing, but with gender. Right? You have to treat the genders equally in any federal sort of program. Public Law 94, 142, that's the beginning of special education. Reauthorizes IDEA, the Individual with Disabilities Education Act in 1990. Same thing with people with disabilities. You must include them in the environment. You can't segregate them out. And you must give them a free and appropriate public education. It always is about equal access. So when we're looking at the federal role in education, one of the things that is always concerned about is preventing segregation. And there's two types, de jure, which just means by law, and de facto, which means by fact. I grew up in Littleton, New Hampshire, went and got educated down the road in Hanover for 4 years, lived there for a while, was actually a principal of a little Christian school over there. That'll come into play a little later on. Then my wife and I left for Virginia to get a master's, for me to get a master's and a doctorate in education. I did it from Williamsburg for my doctoral program. And they took me to the middle school in Williamsburg, and they said to me, do you notice anything about this school? I don't know much about it. And they said, well, look at the classrooms in the back of the school. I said, okay. They said they're smaller. This was the black high school. And the people who built it knew that the people who were going to come and oversee this school were never going to go to the back of it. So they cut the classrooms down in the back, knowing that no one would ever catch them. But in Williamsburg, the South had a long history of de jure segregation. Black high school here, white high school here, and it actually took federal troops going down to Arkansas to integrate the schools. But then there was de facto segregation. At the time, like I said, I was a Christian school principal. We went down to Williamsburg and we put our own children in Christian school because of our Christian beliefs. We believed that the public school wasn't really meeting our needs, and we felt we needed to put our kids in a private school. And someone came up to me and said, why do you have your kids in a segregation academy? I said, segregation academy? What are you talking about? I have them. Same time when my daughter came home and said, I said, hey, honey, what are you studying at school? She said, the War of Northern Aggression. I said, no, we're not in Kansas anymore. But the Christian school that my kids were in was a religious school at the time, but in previous lives, it had been a segregation academy. It had been a private school that was founded when integration happened so that white people could send their children to a school and they wouldn't have to be integrated. That's de facto segregation, when by either private choice or just by the way people make choices, they end up in fact being segregated. So the other thing we see with this public education, this ideal, has been equal access and making sure that all people get the same education, there are people who feel left out. And those people often vote with their feet, but then the system, the public education system, kind of evolves to them. Like like if you look in, we talked about that factory school, and that factory school in the 1950s was very Protestant. There were people reading prayer. Anyone remember having prayers read over there in Annisville? Yeah, were they Jewish prayers? Were they non-believers? They were Jesus as your Lord and Savior, and let's believe in Jesus prayers. We had very Protestant schools in the 1950s, and Catholics and Jewish people started to form private schools. That was the beginning of the kind of the strong Catholic school movement, the Jewish school movement. They felt that they weren't included in the Big Ten. The first case to come about, Engel versus Patel, said you cannot have official school prayers. You cannot have a state actor going on the microphone and saying, "Now, children, all bow your head and pray." You can teach about religion, but you can't teach religion itself. So from that point, we had kind of Protestant schools. Of course, like in all things, the pendulum swung all the way to the other side. And you got the idea that schools could have no religion in them. Oh my goodness, we can't have a Christmas tree. We can't talk about any sort of religion. And there was people who felt that the schools became very humanist, very secular. And so another wave of private schools came from the Christians. The Christians were like, and that's kind of where I was. I felt public school was kind of, contrary to some of the beliefs that I held as a family. I felt that they were hostile to Christian beliefs. And so I put my kids in a private Christian school. And, there came about a balance of that. Because, when we talk about it, is there such a thing as separation of church and state? And the answer is not in the Constitution. I mean, that is a concept that comes from some of our founding fathers in their individual writing. But in the Constitution, you're always balancing the two clauses. You're balancing the establishment. Government shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. So state actors can't do certain things. And we can't, as a government, use money to establish religious services or so forth. However, you also can't prohibit the free exercise. So as individuals coming into schools, they have the right to freely exercise their religion as individuals. So you have the Lamb's Chapel case and also the Religious Freedom Restoration Act of 1993. That was kind of when Ronald Reagan was around, and it was like, it kind of brought some balance. Lamb's Chapel was about a church that wanted to come in and run a Bible study in the school. You want to run a Bible club? No, you can't run a Bible club, that's religious. And they said, but you run a chess club, you run a French club, you run every other club, and the response to that was, yeah, you can run a Bible club, but it can't be sponsored by the school. If the school is going to have what they call a limited open forum, and they're going to allow clubs to happen, then you can't discriminate against a Bible club because of its viewpoint. You can do time, place, and manner, but you can't discriminate just because it's a Christian club. And that was the same with the Religious Restoration Act. So like now in both middle school and high school, we have a Bible club. It has to be primarily run by students. We do have a faculty advisor who sits in who can't participate because that would be a state actor promoting religion. But the Bible club can run, and it's run mostly by the students, and they have the pastors come in and do some help. So you can see, we've had people leave the school, but then there's been some balancing within the public school system and come back. Homeschoolers fleeing from government schools. There's a certain amount of homeschoolers, maybe free staters or people like that who feel that or extreme libertarians, who feel that they don't want anything to do with a government school because the government is trying to control their lives, control their children. And recently, we've had a number of parental rights legislation come forward in New Hampshire. If the school is too much infringing on your right as a family, you have the right to opt out of individual lessons. They're talking now about a bill to opt out of the state assessment. You've probably heard all the battles. I want to opt out of the Common Core. Okay, well, I really can't do that because do you want to opt out of addition? Do you want to opt out of subtraction? But the idea that parents should have more control over specific things that happen with their children is a reaction to people saying, okay, the schools aren't there. And then the last one, some parents have left the public schools because of low quality. And I think that's where our present voucher, most of the arguments are. We should give parents a voucher so they can leave a school of low quality and get a school of better quality. But the public school is addressing quality also with the standards and assessment and No Child Left Behind and ESSA. All right, where am I? All right, so yeah, one more thing, and then we'll open it up for questions, or we'll look at some questions. So this is me, where I have come to land, and it's been a journey. As I said, I started in the private Christian schools. I was principal of one, and I would have been in total support of SB 193, kind of, if I was back then, because I had parents paying tuition to send their kids to my private school, had difficulty meeting payroll. Boy, that money would have come in handy. But we always knew that with federal money would have come, or with state money would have come state control. So we were a little leery about that. But this is what I've come to believe. I've really come to believe in the public school. I've come to believe in the public school more than just, it's a good way to educate children, but it's really foundation to our democracy, and especially the structure. The structure of the modern public school. We don't discriminate against people. We don't discriminate against people because of their creed, religion, their race, their sexual orientation. Everyone comes into the tent. We try not as much as possible to segregate kids out. We try to have inclusive classes. We try to have classes of mixed ability as much as possible. And the modern school is moving toward a personalization and moving toward a place where individual needs can be met. So here's the issue. Educational politics, really, since A Nation at Risk came out and they said that if a foreign nation had executed on America what the public schools had, we would be at war with them because of the low quality. Wasn't true, but it came out and it kind of has dominated the idea. And if you look at the argument, a lot of it is about quality. To get a quality school, we need to give parents vouchers so they can choose to go to a private school or choose to go to a charter school, and then competition will magically bring about quality. But behind that is also segregation. And you got to realize that. When schools were fighting being racially integrated, they never said, we're against integration. What they said is, we're for states' rights. And there were code words and so forth. And I think the same thing happens here. Yeah, we're talking about school quality. We're talking about giving parents the rights to choose. When it comes down to it, it comes down to segregation. We want our kids to go over here, and those kids, however you define those kids, to be away from ours. We don't want to go to the public school. We don't want to be part of that big melting pot. And it's really kind of part of that. And I think if you look at the public school, it is really the good structure for our democracy. Come together, figure out what we want to do, work together, and make changes if we need to. So here are some questions. Is education a private or a public right? Who owns the child? Ultimately, is the child owned by the parent or they're owned by the state?
By the child.
Or the child himself, right? Who'd have thought that we would let a child own themselves? But if you think about a communist state, right? The state owns the child, the state directs the education of that child. In America, we've really given a lot of the child's education over to the parents, and the parents can direct that. I mean, think about New Hampshire, compulsory education, and a whole idea of compulsory education. We don't really have it in New Hampshire. The homeschool laws are very, very liberal, and it's very easy to homeschool. We've always recognized that parents have a right to choose the upbringing of their children. Homeschool, private school, other places, and we have a long history in New Hampshire, good, solid private schools, religious schools. So we do recognize that parent's choice. Now comes the big question: who should pay for a child's education? Who should pay for the child's education? If the parent's going to pay for the child's education, then have at it. Go wherever you want to go, and you can educate your child however you're going to do it. However, if the state is going to pay for the education, then they must do so equally. If the state is going to collect taxpayer money from the community and then start distributing it out, that's what all the federal legislation was about. That's what Brown versus Board of Education was about. That's what Title IX was about, IDEA. All of those federal laws were about, we need to make sure we distribute that equally without discrimination or bias. So the question now comes when you look at SB 193, can parental choice be part of the solution? In one sense, you already have parental choice for education. How many people move to Bow for the schools? Okay, why? Why'd you move to Bow for the schools?
High graduation rate.
High graduation rate? Okay.
Good education.
And do you pay a premium for living in Bow for the schools? Yeah, I'm hearing about that right now. I'm with the budget committee. I'm hearing about it left and right. But in one sense, the hard thing about it is schools are, in other states it's not true, but in New Hampshire and New England, schools tend to be paid for mostly by the locality. And so there are very wide differences in qualities between localities. I started in Bristol, up in Newfound, Winnisquam, Laconia, whole different demographic, whole different quality of school. Bow, Hanover, Amherst, Bedford. So in one sense, maybe our present public school system, especially in New Hampshire, is flawed in that we do have segregation. We have segregation by class. Certain people come to Bow, other people go to what they can afford. And that's what all the Claremont lawsuits were about. The Claremont lawsuits and adequate education and so forth. And so the courts have gone in and tried to remedy that. Haven't quite totally been successful yet because we don't like to spend any money. But could we have parent choice as part of the solution? I mean, in one sense we do, because you can choose to move to a community that values education. You can send your child to a private school on your own dime. You can homeschool, so there is there. But we've had this new thing come about, an educational voucher. And it's good in one sense. It's going to give parents an adequacy payment, like about $3,500, that they can take to any school of their choice and apply. And of course, because New Hampshire doesn't have a whole lot of money, they're going to take that adequacy payment away from the school that's there. And the rhetoric and the hope is that these people who are either don't like the school because of religious reasons, they don't like the school because of cultural issues, or they don't like the school because of quality issues, will then be able to go to different places and spend their educational voucher and be able to have the schooling of their choice. But the fundamental question that no one brings up is that means education is a private or a public right? I mean, I saw on one website the other day, someone was talking about the voucher system, and they said, we shouldn't pay for education at all. It's a total parental responsibility, and public dollars should not be used to pay for education at all. Another thing when you start looking at giving a voucher to a parent and parent choice, can you totally respect that parent's decision? If the parent chooses to take the educational voucher and go home and not educate their children, does the state have a right to step in and say you can't do that? What if the parent chooses to send their child to a school that espouses certain beliefs that are not mainstream or un-American? What if the parent chooses to send a child to like recently that one that made the news, that parent who had their kids, the 13 kids who were they were homeschooled. Well, actually, they weren't homeschooled. He was a school. He had gone through the process and declared himself the principal of his own school. What if a voucher is used for that? The nice thing about a public school is they're publicly accountable. I have to go before you every year and talk about the budget. I have to talk about curriculum. We have open meetings. And you as voters have redress in your public school. You can always vote a new school board in. You can vote up or down on a lot of warrant articles and so forth. There's public accountability. So that's another issue of that. And then the last one, what about segregation? What about segregation? If we do put SB 193 in and it's put forth, is that going to increase segregation? Is it going to increase the haves and have-nots? I mean, I am so worried about this country right now that we have not seen such a disparity in wealth between the haves and the have-nots since the Gilded Age. And the Gilded Age was corrected by the Great Depression. And you know, you look at the money that some of these people have, and then the way they're getting involved in politics, the Koch brothers, or on the other side, the Gates and so forth. It's like there's a lot of money out there, and there's just that extreme difference. Do we care that those people segregate? I mean, they already do, because if you're that wealthy, you send your kids to private school, you send your kids to the preps, and they never have to, you know, hang out with the other kids in public school, those kids. And I think that's the argument. Well, we want to open up that experience to middle class. They say lower class, but really, can that happen? I mean, if you give someone a $3,000 voucher, is it really going to take someone with a lower class income and be able to go to prep school? All right, I've talked way too much at you. So at this point, I just open up to, you know, these are my issues with SB 193. I have to be careful. I'm not supposed to be particularly partisan, but there are some superintendents whose boards have told them, you know, go out and testify against SB 193 and talk about it. There are other boards who tell their superintendent, that's how you roll. We support SB 193. So as a superintendent, I represent all people in my community. There are people who really see this as a positive bill. I was at my mom's funeral this last weekend, and one of my nephews sends 2 of his kids to private Catholic school. They are hardcore Catholics, and they want their kids in that Catholic school, and he's very happy that he could get $3,500 toward their tuition. And I had a hard time telling him, you should send your kids to public school, because he's committed to it, and he pays his taxes, and he feels that that's all right. But these are some of the questions that I kind of ask about this bill. So questions, comments, go ahead.
I'm a senior citizen, and I'm a property owner, and I pay my school taxes every year, and I've been in New Hampshire for 25 years. I did have one child go through the New Hampshire system, but I paid, but only 1 out of 5 because of the time we moved here. But I see it as the education and everybody having an equal opportunity at education supports the country that I want to live in, you know, supports the community that I want to live in. I pay my school taxes because I want to live in a community and a state in a country that values education and believes that a strong democratic country educates its children, no matter who they are. So just, you know, and I, as a senior citizen, I could say, hey, look, you know, I don't have kids in school. Give me my $3,500. So, but I believe that we have a responsibility to see that our kids are educated, and that public education is the best way to do that. And like you say, that public education is working hard to try to resolve some of these differences, and working hard also to get very disparate members of the community working together. And so I pay my school taxes and believe that I am creating a better society.
Anyone else?
Yeah. I pay my taxes, and the school taxes, I can
say to principals, classroom teachers, superintendents, the Board of Education, how I feel about this curriculum or that policy, et cetera. So there's accountability. I put my money in, but it doesn't go down a black hole. I can follow it. I can see how it's being used. I do not understand SB 193, how they can take my tax dollar, hand it to a parent, and say that parent can do whatever he or she likes, and I, the taxpayer, providing that money, don't have any control over how it's spent. I mean, does that make any sense?
Well, if you look at the SB 193 bill text now and the legislative history of it, they've tried to put accountability there.
But the only accountability measure I see in the text is that there has to be some assessment, but it's not specified what that assessment will be.
Yep.
And there's no way, if you don't specify an assessment that is the same as the public school assessment, there's no way to see whether those tax dollars are providing the an equal education.
It'd be interesting for me to see how the homeschooling population reacts to this, because part of it would be, yeah, give me the $3,000, and that'll help me in my homeschool. But they fought hard over the last decade to basically remove homeschooling from any sort of governmental oversight. It used to be that if you went to homeschool, you had to inform me as superintendent every year. You had to show me what your program was, and you had to show me an assessment at the end of the year that you're making progress. And now you have to inform me once in your child's lifetime. And so people ask me, how many homeschoolers do you have in Bow? And I said, I have no idea. I just have no concept. My sister-in-law is also a superintendent, and she's in Berlin, facing very different demographics and very different issues that I have. And she's actually lobbying this year to return to the homeschooling regulations that we had, where you had to have a program approved and you had to have some assessment. Because what she sees in Berlin, and we see it a little bit here in Bow, families who are struggling will start talking with them about truancy, or your child's having issues in school. In order to avoid any sort of scrutiny of their family life, they'll homeschool and they'll get away from that. And you think about that family that was out there with those 13 kids, where they weren't in school. I mean, and not that the government should own children or so forth, but that is a preventive factor. And that's what she sees up in Berlin. She's got a lot of opioid addicted people. She's got parents who won't necessarily make the right choice for their children because they're just struggling to survive themselves, taking the voucher and then doing whatever they want with it and not necessarily educating the child.
Dr. Cascadden, isn't, we hear a lot about taxes in this community. People are very aware of their tax bill. Isn't SB 193 potentially setting us up for a tax increase because you've got that $3,000 following the child, but then you still have the infrastructure to maintain your public school? So then you've got to maintain that $3,000 for that student leaving your school district, but you still have this relatively the same amount of, staff that you need to maintain your building. Those hard bills that aren't going to go, they're not going to diminish at all. Utilities. Is that so?
That was the other process, and that's where presently it's in the finance committee right now, and that's that kind of the Achilles heel of the bill. And you see, watching legislation being made is fascinating. It's like sausage being made. You don't want to watch it too closely because you'll never eat it. But as they were going through this bill, that was the big issue. So they put in these, you're not going to lose so much of your adequate education grant and so forth. But when you go to like a place like Reaching Higher New Hampshire and you start looking at what's the possible ramifications of this, it's pretty large. So on top of a number of costs being shifted from the state to the locality over the last decade. I mean, if you want to know why your local property taxes are up, it's because things that used to be paid for by the state are not. And I can go through a list of things that I wrote tonight: retirement, aid, and so forth. They don't fund what they're supposed to fund right now. I mean, okay, we'll pay for all-day kindergarten, but we'll only pay for 3/4 of it. We'll do it through gambling. I mean, really? Special ed aid is prorated. Building aid is I mean, they're not meeting the obligation. And let's just start. Of course, I'm going to go off on a rant here. Adequate education, 3,500. Who can pay for an adequate education for 3,500? So the state's not adequately funding now. So what possibly would happen in Bow? Do we have children who might take advantage of the scholarship? Well, we have a number of children who go to Bishop Brady. We have a number of children who go to some charters and private schools. We have another number of children who go to boarding private schools. Would they be eligible for the scholarship? Depends. I mean, I think one of the things they put in the bill was, well, you have to leave a public school. You have to be in there for the adequacy first, and then you have to leave the public school, and then you'll be eligible for the voucher, because they didn't want all those people taking advantage of the voucher. But where's the caveat in there? I'm going to come to Bow, I'm going to register my student for however long it takes, get eligible for the voucher and leave. So we don't know what the fiscal effect is. And that's why Neil Kirk is so concerned with the bill. You don't know what this fiscal effect really is going to be, except for it's going to be, you're going to be paying a lot of money. Oh no, but it's free because we're going to take that adequacy money away from schools. Okay. And the argument is, if you don't have the kids, then what do you need the money for? Okay, but I'm still, if I lose 2 kids out of Mrs. Swenson's classroom, am I going to pay you 2 kids less in your salary? No.
The room still needs to be heated.
It still needs to be heated. I still have the same order. If I get enough drop in enrollment, yeah, I can make some changes and so forth. The other one goes to the whole concept of segregation and also discrimination in the bill. Will special ed education children, will poor children be able to take advantage of this bill as much as rich people or higher class people? And if they don't, then does that increase segregation, and does that move money out of the public school while they are still educating more difficult children to educate? Children of poverty and children with disabilities take more resources to educate. Just they do. And if we move out certain classes of people and leave other classes there, then what's your answer to that one? It's going to cost more to educate them, and the resources aren't there. Comments? Go ahead. You
Question. In New Hampshire, do they allow students, say, from Manchester to come to Bow? I mean, is there that exchange that you see? I mean, I know there
is with some
questions.
towns.
Like Norwich, Vermont kids can go to Hanover. So
one of the only, well, that and Rivendell are the 2 interstate areas.
do they allow it?
Presently, Bow has an area agreement with Dunbarton. So we sat down with the town of Dunbarton and set up a tuition agreement there. And we allow Dunbarton students to come here, or actually, we don't allow. All Dunbarton students need to come here. It is a area agreement that's exclusive.
I'm from Dunbarton.
Yes. Right. So all the Dunbarton students can't go to another school if they're going to be paid for by the town. They're paid for by the town to come here. With Hooksett, we have something called a memorandum of understanding. And what we do is we kind of top off our 9th grade classes to get our optimal level, and we take a certain amount of Hooksett students. And in that case, what happens is Hooksett pays a base amount, and then parents have to kick in the rest, which is now about $1,000 to $2,000. So we have about 5 or 6 Hooksett students in each of our high school classes. No one's ever questioned the constitutionality of that, whether or not it's okay for a locality to pay part of the tuition and the parent to pick up the rest, but that's there. But the interesting thing is, as this bill gets traction, I get phone calls all the time. Hi, I'm in Manchester. I'd like to send my kid to Bow. Well, I would suggest you move to Dunbarton or Bow, because that's the only way you can guarantee to come here. Even if you're in Hooksett, you're not guaranteed to come here.
I was just wondering, because models in other states which allow that, is there that exchange of money so that if I wanted to send my children, which I have to worry about to send them to a Catholic school, would you require that Catholic school then reimburses Bow, for instance?
You talk about other states. In other states where the state has a much larger role in paying for education, then there's not this high barrier for the localities to move. I've had people move from the West and say, well, out West, if I want to move my kid to a school district, I just get a note from their mom and say, I want to move school districts. And I said, yeah, because in the West, the state pays, and so it really doesn't matter where those kids go. The money falls.
Equality, less segregation or discrimination.
Right. But in New Hampshire, because the localities pay for education almost exclusively, like 75–80%, we have a high residency bar and a high. So anyway, the short answer to the question is we just don't have the room to take a lot of people.
Right.
And so that's the other thing with the voucher. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to go with this voucher? You get it. Where are you going to go? And one of the problems they've had in other states is some for-profit schools have risen up and really ripped people off for educational value. Good.
So you had mentioned concerned parents leave schools for better quality schools. So I work in a town, that was one of the towns you mentioned, and some of the parents are thinking, hey, Bedford is a very challenging school. It was great for my first 2 kids, but the 3rd kid just isn't that scholarly student. Wouldn't it be great if we got that voucher and sent them to a less challenging school? And I think, no. But one of the former school board members who's a rep voted for it.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, what is happening?
Yeah.
Why would you do that? And I know there are issues within the school that we need to address, like for those kids who are not of that rigor, maybe we need some better programming, but don't let them leave.
I guess I understand about your program, and I see people who support it, and I don't demonize them because I understand. You know, I was in that world for a long time, and I understand that. I understand not being in the public, but I think the answer is to fund public education and to regulate public education and be involved in public education. And I'm a recent
Work
convert.
through
to that
the
belief.
problems that we have.
The chair of the House Education Committee, Rick Ladd, at an education conference, explained why he supports SB 193. And it was an experience he had with his grandkids up in Haverhill,
Yeah.
where the schools weren't addressing their needs.
Yeah.
And, you know, in conversation with him, as I, said, it seems to me unfortunate that that's the case. But if truly you have a manifest hardship, you can go to the State Board of Education and seek relief and have a change. But it's also the case, as you've been saying, that New Hampshire schools, by and large, are good schools.
Second only in Massachusetts.
Yes, but the fact of the matter is, there are schools that need improvement.
Yep.
And draining money from them is not the way to improve them. So this bill, although I'm sympathetic to a Representative Ladd, at the end of the day, he is making certain that not only his grandkids, but future generations will not be well served by the public schools by supporting this bill, because the resources our schools need, to improve those schools that require improvement won't be there.
Let me talk a little bit about school quality just for a second. You always hear that how American schools don't measure up internationally. If we were to compare apples to apples, the issue with America is we educate all. That's that whole equity thing. If other nations had to be held to the same standards that we have for equity and educating all their students to high standards, then we would blow most other nations out of the world. Our literacy rate's the highest it's ever been. And part of it is the economy is demanding it. There are very few blue-collar, physical labor jobs, and they're going away at a rapid pace. You're not going to see people working in McDonald's anymore. I mean, what's the one that opened today? The convenience store with no workers in it. You walk in the convenience store, you grab things off the shelves, you walk out the door, and it automatically subtracts off your debit card. You don't need a convenience store worker anymore. So those low-level, low-skilled jobs are going away in the economy. We need to train almost every one of our people to work in teams, to think, to produce things. And I don't think you do that by segregation going off. I think you do it by sticking together in a common school and improving the common school.
I am